So where do I really begin with us picking up on our journey in the book of Revelation and the 7 churches within the framework of struggling churches, dying churches, dead churches? Those of you who follow us realize that we were not here last week. We did not post a video, just a brief explanation of what was going on. So let me back up a little bit as I ramp up and try to honor the time that we have today. And I confess to you that it's a struggle to sort of get back in the rhythm. It was almost 2 years ago when my wife and I met her sister and our brother-in-law in Laurel, Mississippi, the place where the TV show Hometown is shot. They were all fans of that. And it was there that my sister-in-law, Nancy, first was exhibiting signs of some health issues that were really uncertain. She had a cough that simply could not go away, and the doctor thought it was just allergies or other typical issues, and so that's how he was treating her. And it wasn't until sometime later that year, when it was just unrelenting, that she went back. They did additional testing, and they discovered that she had stage 4 non-small cell metastatic lung cancer. And they began the long journey of treatment. I went online, as I always do, as the researcher I am, and I read about this particular issue, and it was a condition that doctors will tell you that there's not a cure for. They treat it, but there's no cure. And the prognosis is always an issue of how much time a person actually has before they live. And it was measured in years. X percentage will make it 1 year, X percentage 2 years, X percentage, and the longest anyone makes it is 5 years. And that's an extremely low percentage. And so I sort of knew what was ahead, and so they went on that journey. And so last year, I believe it was last summer, we took the trip to Texas. And for those of you who have not driven from Charleston, South Carolina to Newton, Texas, it's 1,000 miles. And so we went last summer and spent some time with them and watching her struggle with her treatment. And then we went back in December to see her once again as her condition continued to deteriorate. Between June and December, many of you know that that's when our daughter-in-law, Susan, Jonathan's wife, passed away. She had contracted COVID. She had other comorbidities that ended her life. And so our life was, pretty tough as it was. So we went back in December and spent some time with her, not knowing how much time we have left, knowing that Sarah and Nancy were the 2 surviving members of her immediate family. And then my brother-in-law notified me, I guess it was 6 weeks ago, that they had decided in the middle of the night to stop all forms of treatment and to begin the hospice journey. So we made that 2,000-mile trip, driving every time. I'm not going to wear a mask and fly anywhere right now. Not because I'm afraid, it's just I'm not going to wear a mask. And so we made the trip back to spend some time so that Sarah could have some time with her sister. And the hospice folks said, we don't know. Typically it's, a person lasts 17 days. So we spent 10 days there, and she was pretty stable. And here's an image to show you what life was like. They'd converted the living room into the bedroom, and there is Nancy with her husband John and their 3 daughters, Michelle and Cindy and Jenny. And so we spent some time with them as a family and then came back waiting. I notified my brother-in-law, I guess it was a week ago on Monday, and said, when the hospice people tell you it's a matter of hours, then let me know and we will go ahead and make our way there. So last Wednesday, on April the 6th, this was the text I received from John. We don't think it will be long. Her breathing changed. Call the nurse. Her blood pressure is 50/38. All the girls are around her. Just don't know, but we think it could be any moment. Just wanted to let you know. So our kids had already been notified, Jonathan and Abigail, that we were going to be making this trip. And so that very day, we headed out for Texas, went by way of Valdosta, Georgia, where our daughter is, and picked her up and made the 1,000-mile trip back to Newton. And we arrived there sometime on Thursday evening. She had passed away that Wednesday at 11:55. So we made our way back and said our goodbyes, had the memorial service there at the First Baptist Church in Jasper. And then immediately following the service and lunch, we loaded the truck up and came home. So through this whole thing, I'm thinking about us. I'm thinking about what I feel called to do. I'm thinking about this journey and our conversation and this study. And realizing now for months, literally, we have been clock watching. Knowing it's only a matter of time, but you don't know when the clock is going to strike midnight and everything change. But we know that death is imminent because all of the indicators are there. Now, you and I both know that death is always imminent. I could walk outside and get bitten by a foreign bug or something and die. I'm talking about all the indicators in terms of life and health that we know. We were on death watch and waiting for what we didn't want to hear, but we knew it was coming, and we made peace with that, and so we have shared that journey up to this point. I guess I share that because everything that I do, everything that I experience in life comes back to this, what I feel like I'm called to do in the framework and the context and the circumstances and the opportunities. Realizing that I can't fabricate opportunities. I can only do the best that I can with the opportunities that I do have and pray for more. And so everything is for me is filtered through that paradigm of my sense of calling and purpose. And so was this journey with Nancy and the family. And it was tough. So I got to thinking about us, and in our ongoing conversations and journey, there are some people who support our ministry financially, and it's appreciated because it's enabled me to purchase equipment to do the kind of things that we're doing. There's no salary, no income involved in this. It's simply spent on the purposes of ministry, and I'm grateful for that. And one of the people that I have received support, or we have received support from, sent me this note. I think it came in last week. And it's from Gina Hartman, who resides in Catonsville, Maryland. And she writes, "Dear Pastor Pope, I write you to thank you for your new mission in helping the churches who are failing. When I attend my church here in Maryland, I worry for I see very little young people. I hope you help this. Fondly, Gina." Well, first off, Gina, thank you. Those words of encouragement. But I thought about Gina, I thought about you, within this whole framework of the journey that we've been on, that in some way that you are on a death watch as well. I don't know which church you're a part of. I know a number of the churches and pastors in Catonsville. I don't know which church it happens to be. But in your description, you talk about watching things that aren't pleasant and are not indicators of health for the church. And it concerns me, concerns you. And I realize that just as we have been, you are on a clock watching moment, not knowing how long it's going to last, and hoping and praying that someone can make a difference. And you and I both know that you can't help somebody that does not want help. So this is a word to you about these kind of circumstances. And we're simply entitling this study today in Revelations 2, verses 12 through 17 is Insidious Mortality. Because mortality is what? It's dying. It's an end of life kind of thing. And when I read, for whatever reason, I just indulge my mental processes. When I read this passage about the church at Pergamum, this was sort of what came to my mind. So just simply indulge me as we walk through the process. And there are three things, and I'm going to borrow this from a very old Clint Eastwood movie called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And that's how we're going to frame our journey through this passage. So follow along as we read this. First is the good. That is verses 12 through 13. And the angel of the church of Pergamum write, the one who has the sharp two-edged sword says this, I know where you dwell, where Satan's throne is, and you hold fast my name, and did not deny my faith, even in the days of Antipas my witness, my faithful one, who was killed among you where Satan dwells. So the good is where these passages, these letters to the churches or to the pastors, they're referred to as angels here, to the messenger, the pastor of these churches, starts on this good note, talking about that which they had done. That they were in a place, in a time, in a set of circumstances, which is described here as where Satan's throne is. And I don't know about you, but that's not a flattering commentary on where you live. And yet he says that despite having that sort of identity in that culture, being where Satan's throne is, that you hold fast my name. You did not deny my faith, even in the days of Antipas, my witness, who was killed among you. Now, we don't have any historical information about Antipas. There's always speculation, there's always myths and legends that grow up, but there's no historical evidence. We simply know that he's described here as a witness. The Greek word is martyrios, from which we get our word martyr. That because of his commitment to Jesus Christ and the principles of faith, that Antipas lost his life. And so to the church at Pergamum, it is said that you, the church, held fast my name, even when somebody among you died a martyr's death, in that very place where Satan dwells. Now, in trying to wrap my mind around what John is writing to this church and all the implications, I came across this graphic depiction of Pergamum. Pergamum, it is described, it's in modern-day Turkey. It is just north of where Ephesus stands. And it was a place that started out being built on a hill. And that hill was a place where three rivers came together. And it was described in the ancient world as the place where the crossroads of all the known worlds came through Pergamum. And so it became a place that just blew up in its commerce and in its identity. And it became a religious center as well. It became a Roman city. It became a popular place to be recognized. It was an affluent place and an influential place. And you had all of these temples that were constructed there. Temple to Zeus and Apollo and Athena and Dionysus and Aphrodite, but especially to Asclepius. So this is the place where the church of Pergamum was founded. As a result of a missionary journey, somebody going there, sharing the gospel, having somebody to respond, and as others responded, they formed what we know as a church. We don't know what the numbers would have been back then, but we know that this was a Roman city in a pagan culture in which this church came to exist. And its early commendation and commentary was there were those among that body of believers that paid the ultimate price. They lost their lives because of their faith. And it didn't shake the church. Even though it says you were living where Satan dwells. So apparently the commentary by Jesus via John in this letter was that you could not find a less healthy spiritual place on planet Earth to be described as where Satan dwells. Now, I don't know about you, but there have been times when I feel like I live there as well, because everything is against that which is true and righteous and pure and the gospel and the teachings of Scripture. We know that. So the good was that they were in a place that was not a good place spiritually. They were experiencing things, martyrdom, which was not something that you signed up for or wanted to participate in. But if it had to happen and it came, that you were willing to pay the ultimate price and take a stand for Jesus. And so that little church first receives this commendation. Here's an image of some of the some of the findings as they continue to try to reconstruct this ancient city. Never been there, don't know if I'll ever have the chance, but it was a monumental place. Now Asclepius was the god that this city became known for this pagan deity. You have there on one side the remains of a statue that was found, on the other side a reproduction of the statue, and Asclepius was known for having a staff that had a serpent wrapped around it. And so in some sense, even though you had all these other temples and all these other gods that were there, and all these forms of worship, he was the primary one that they worshipped. But one of the things that we know, they worship the serpent, that we know that in all of these pagan temples, you had immoral practices. Because it was common in the ancient world to connect human sexuality with their spiritual experience. I leave it to you to figure out why they decided to do that, although it would make their religion very, very popular to a pagan culture. It's sort of the opposite of the, back in the 19th century in upstate New York. It was sort of the birthplace of a lot of different religious groups. And there was one religious group that was a Christian group that came along that sort of went to the other end of the spectrum from the ancient world and pagan worship. And they didn't incorporate sexual practice into their religion. They forbade it. They believed that to honestly serve God and to fulfill His purposes, you had to commit to monogamy. No sexual interaction at all, even between husbands and wives. And believe it or not, there were some people that joined that group. I don't think there was a second generation, because that wasn't very very exciting to think about, especially since those were things that God had blessed. But in this pagan culture there, it had been incorporated in all those other religious practices, and those Christians lived in that environment. And Antipas died in that environment, and the church sort of held pat under those circumstances. So that was the good. I mean, that's pretty good to say you're living in a pagan culture where everything is against you, and even you're losing your lives, but you can be commended because you held your ground. Now, we don't have any metrics for this. We can only guess that this church was birthed sometime in the middle part of the 1st century. This letter, these words of John to the church, are written at the end of that century. So we're still sort of within a one-generation lifespan of that church. So we don't know how long they carried on holding forth the faith under the worst of circumstances. So that was the good. And then there was the bad, verses 14 through 15. Revelation 2, beginning in verse 14. But I have a few things against you, because you have there some who hold the teaching of Balaam, who kept teaching Balak to put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit acts of immorality. So you also have some who are in the same way, holding the teaching of the Nicolaitans. Now, in my trying to wrap my mind around this, and pardon me as I even struggle to find the words to describe this, this is very curious. Out of all the things that Jesus could have told John to write to this church about, he draws from an Old Testament reference from the book of Numbers, verses 22 through 25. A scene from the time when Israel had become a nation in Egyptian bondage. Moses had been sent by God as a prophet to deliver them from Egypt to make their way up to the promised land. Having gone through the Red Sea, having received the 10 Commandments, having faced people that opposed their journey, tried to stop them unsuccessfully, to where we come to a pagan king by the name of Balak, who had seen what had happened to the other nations who opposed the nation of Israel. And he attempted to contract this pagan prophet to come and pronounce a curse. And it would appear that this pagan prophet was, he was ecumenical. He didn't just represent one faith. It's like, he wore many hats, that whatever your belief system was, that he could come and sort of speak to that. And so when the emissaries from Balak got to Balaam, Balaam says, well, let me go check it out with the man upstairs and see what he has to say. And after spending some time, he came back and he said, I can't do it. The Lord says, don't do this. But Balak insisted and said, you don't have to make any commitments. Just come and let me show you what I'm talking about. And it's in that context that we have one of the more infamous, should I say, stories or accounts in the Old Testament, where Balaam is making his way on this mission when he has a conversation with his donkey. The donkey is riding on, sees the angel of the Lord standing in the way with a sword drawn. And the donkey is trying to avoid being a victim of the angelic sword. So much so that Balaam keeps hitting him and cussing at him and giving the poor donkey what for, until finally the donkey, trying to avoid that sword, messes up Balaam's foot, presses him against the wall. And finally, after beating down this poor donkey, the donkey turns around and says, "What are you hitting me for?" Now, do what you will with an account like this that talks about a talking beast of burden. Can donkeys really talk? If you ask that question, it means you've never been to Washington, D.C., because there are all kinds of donkey talking going on there. But whatever you do with that passage, this is a scene out of this narrative about Balaam that is being referenced, strangely enough, in this passage. That when John comes to write, after he talks about the good things that the church can be commended for, that he said, "I have a few things against you because you hold the teaching of Balaam, who kept teaching Balak." Now, we don't have a specific reference here that Balaam was teaching these things to Balak, but we have no reason to doubt that it's the case. And what he was teaching Balak was to put stumbling blocks before the sons of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit acts of what? Immorality. So when you go back and read that account, and we're not going to take the time to do that, is that when Balaam went and he stood on a high place to see this great sea of people in the nation of Israel, he couldn't curse them. He pronounced the blessing. And Balak didn't go over real well with him. He said, well, maybe you didn't get to see it, right? Let's go to a better place that's similar. So he took him to another place. Same thing happened. And finally Balak says, well, listen, if you can't curse them, at least don't bless them. And then we have sort of a conclusion of that narrative in chapter 24. And then when we turn to Numbers chapter 25, these are the first words we find. While Israel remained in Shittim, the people began to play the harlot with the daughters of Moab. For they invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel joined themselves to Baal of Peor, and the Lord was angry against Israel. The good was they didn't deny the faith when martyrdom came. The bad was that there was an insidious activity, practice, idea, philosophy, theology that crept in to that body of believers in the church at Pergamum. Now, we don't know exactly what that was. That here they are in an affluent city, trying to be salt and light in that place. And the people that are responding to the gospel are bringing all the things that they are into that context. And they're trying to figure out a way to balance relationship with that culture and those people, with those things that had been taught by a planting missionary, realizing that they didn't have a New Testament like we had. They had the Old Testament. They had some letters that had appeared that Paul had written and Peter had written, and that they were in circulation, but they didn't have a completed document known as the New Testament. And so they were doing the best they can. And yet the bad that was said about them, and the reason they were standing under the judgment of God, is that they had lowered their guard in respect to issues of morality. Now, you and I both know, because of current news media, that things that happen anywhere on the planet we can be aware of today. And you and I both know that more than a few preachers, more than a few evangelists, more than a few missionaries, more than a few churches have been undone by loose morals. as we were making our way to Newton, Texas. My younger brother was going to come down on Saturday for the funeral service to be there because he was, friends with them as well. And he called me while we were en route and said, well, sorry, give my regards, my respects to the family, and tell them I can't come on Saturday because I have a funeral to do my own. It's like, well, so who was this? He said, it's not so much that, but I have a funeral, but he said that wasn't the worst thing. He said the worst thing was that my student minister was arrested today. The police came to our building and hauled him away in handcuffs, and he has been accused of sexually abusing children. So it's simply one more story. The jury is still out. The facts are still out. He hasn't been convicted yet, but it's not looking good. So we know at the very least, this is the kind of thing that can be the undoing of a church. But it's not just that. When you think about the struggling churches or the dying churches you know of, they may not have a moral issue at all, but there's something that's been just as insidious creeping in to their practices, their belief systems. So much so that in my thinking through this, because I have served sort of on every part of the spectrum of church life, from going into a rural traditional church to being in an urban traditional church to leading churches through growth and transition and planting and leading an innovative church, and having experienced all those things to realize that every church, New Testament church that gets started on the right foot for the right reason to do the right things. And that they realize that they are there as a lighthouse to sinners. But somewhere along the way, for whatever reason, usually it's a failure of leadership, they stop being a lighthouse for sinners and they become a safe house for saints. And this insidious, creeping sort of idea that we have to guard and protect our own. And so churches start digging moats and putting in drawbridges and building barriers and looking at themselves not as ambassadors of faith in a generation. I mean, look at this. John is telling to the people at Pergamum, you are where Satan's throne is. And you did well until you didn't. There's something in the life of a church. And Gina, I don't know the story of your church, but I do know that there are typical things that happen in the life of the church when the focus goes from looking outside and seeing who the next sinner is who is being invited to be a saint, and it becomes about protecting our own. It changes our message and it changes our method. Or the opposite happens. And that is in trying to fit into a culture, as we will start making accommodations to our faith system. But by and the most insidious thing is beginning practices or embracing practices where the logic is, what harm can it do? It's not clearly prohibited in Scripture. So therefore, because we want to get along and we want people to like us, we want to have a good reputation, so we'll start doing these things. Have nothing whatever to do with the gospel. Have nothing whatever to do with preaching Jesus. They have everything to do with our trying to accommodate our environment to be more acceptable. And the result is really no different than if you have a moral lapse of somebody in spiritual leadership in the church. You and I both know that one of the largest churches in church history, that when they would have a spiritual leader that was guilty of a moral lapse, they would simply move him someplace else and let him start all over again. There was no accountability. There was no paying the piper. And I think it's safe to say that institution has been a dying institution ever since that. And so when John comes to write these words to the church at Pergamum, say, what you did so well, but something happened. There was a subtle, and you look at that serpent on Asclepius' staff, and you see the church can become so concerned about the lions at the door, they don't see the snakes slithering in through the cracks in the building and coming in and making them victims. And so we don't have particulars about what was happening in the Church of Pergamum. And this reference to the Nicolaitans. We've already seen both of these referenced previously in one of the churches. And we don't have details, historical details about that, but there is some sexual, moral inference from that. That somehow there was a lowing, there was a twisting, there was a changing of the guard, and you and I both know that there's nothing, or at least for me, more offensive or repugnant than what we see in wokeism in America. So that there are churches who don't want to be looked down on because they're narrow-minded, who are simply going to say, who am I to judge? When I was attempting to teach accountability, because if you remove the teeth from the lion is no more a threat. If you have parameters in Scripture that says these are the things that are clearly out of bounds for a person who claims to be a follower of Jesus Christ, you shouldn't do these things. And if you're a part of this church, you shouldn't do these things. But if there are no teeth in those prohibitions, and it costs no one nothing if they do those things other than have people look down on them, then you have no parameters and you have no boundaries. And I think for most churches, they remove the sharp edges away from what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. And nothing is more subtle than, it's not even subtle anymore about wokeism, gender identity. It makes me sick. And the church that doesn't take a stand, what is the saying? Silence, signs, consent. And it was one of the things that people always pushed back on me in our last church, was when I tried to instill this sense of mutual accountability. As a pastor, I was accountable to the people that I served. The people that worship with us were accountable to each other in terms of holding to the standards and the principles and the practices. But some people would push back and say, who am I to judge someone else? I can't hold them accountable because I'm not spiritually qualified to do that. Wrong, you are. If you have a relationship with Christ and you're committed to living a life of holiness and purity, and you have other people who sign on and say, me too, count on me, hold my feet to the fire, then we have an obligation to hold each other accountable. Churches who drop their guards, churches that make concessions to be accepted, churches that aren't warning about the insidious nature of certain practices and belief systems, with that simplest one being, what harm can it do? Listen, if it's not doing a holy good, I don't think you should be doing it. It was one of the things that I appreciated about Rick Warren when he first appeared on the scene back in the 80s, and he wrote his book on the purpose-driven church and then the purpose-driven life. And what I liked, I wouldn't agree with Rick on everything. He certainly wouldn't agree with me on everything. But I appreciated the fact that when he distilled the model for the church as he did it, he said the church has 5 basic purposes. And that everything the church does should be in the fulfillment of one of those purposes. And if it doesn't, you shouldn't be doing it. I like that sort of clarity, that succinct nature of stating what those things were, why we exist. And that's a part of what drives me even now, is because I'm still a part of those same kind of passions, doing from this chair, or the opportunities I get to go out and preach from there. So the good was, when they got it right, they got it real right. The bad was, something crept in, got them identified with Balaam and Balak. And it's sort of interesting in that Balaam story is what Balak couldn't get the prophet to do by cursing Israel. He didn't need any help, because the Israelites themselves, in trying to accommodate the culture they were in, began to let their children date pagan children. And they began to show up at pagan practices until they gave themselves in and embraced a pagan god. John says to the church at Pergamum, now you may not consider yourselves a Balak or a Balaam. You may be more like a Balaam's donkey. But the truth was, you dropped your guard and you're at risk of the judgment of God. Churches that find themselves in 2022 in a definite decline, with watching the clock, knowing that at some point You're going to be in the final hours of your life. You didn't get there by accident. You got there because you lowered your guard and you didn't maintain the purposes that God put you there for. So that was the good and the bad. Now the ugly. Verse 16. Therefore repent, or else I am coming to you quickly, and I will make war against them with the sword of my mouth. The ugly. Wow, that's pretty ugly. This is where, this is where the Bible gets the reputation, and even conservative evangelicals get the reputation of preaching a gospel of repent or else. Well, here you have it in black and white. Repent or else I'm coming to you quickly. We didn't make it up. We're just simply quoting the source. So Jesus is saying through John to this church, they have an opportunity. They've gotten off track. They've embraced things they shouldn't embrace. They've discontinued things that they should have continued. And they're at risk at the judgment of God. Therefore, repent. So repent just means what? To turn around, do an about face. They have an opportunity, and if they don't seize that opportunity, Jesus says, I will come to you quickly, and I will make war with them, and with the sword of my mouth. It's interesting for the people who think they're fighting the good fight, when they get off of purpose and off task and off of mission, and they're all about their identity and their reputation and their desires and their interest in maintaining what it is they think is important, they can become the very enemies of the thing they think that they're actually standing for. I will make war against them with the sword of my mouth. It's sort of tragic to think that how many dead and dying churches have ceased to be because Jesus declared war on them. Think about Jesus. All he has to do, he doesn't have to raise his voice. He just has to say, that's it. You're done. My spirit will no longer inhabit you as a people or you as a church. Boy, that's a sad moment when that happens. And unless somebody in that moment asks the questions that the beggars ask at the gates of the city of Damascus, why sit we here until we die? If there's an option for life, shouldn't we pursue that? What does the ugly look like? I've tried to distill this in a way without knowing the details in every church, but just knowing that there's some principles and there's some things that can lead to this being at war with the Spirit of God that you claim to defend. First is, we don't need the devil's help to fail. Israel didn't need Balaam to pronounce a curse on them for them to fail. They were perfectly capable of doing the wrong things without the help of the devil or anyone else. The second thing is that spiritual pride and spiritual blindness are twins. Churches who take pride when things aren't as they should be, when they're not reaching people, they're not seeing people make commitments to the gospel, they're not baptizing people, they're not doing all those kind of things, and they begin to take pride in their buildings and their property and their programs and all these other things that are not necessary to be a church, then spiritual pride and spiritual blindness can be twins. That they're blinded by their own pride to not see that they have gotten away from the task that they were commissioned to at the very beginning. The question for Gina that your church needs to be asking is, what is our purpose? Is our purpose to be a lighthouse or a safe house? And if it's to be a safe house, guess what? Those that are safe will end up dying together, because the lighthouse will cease to have existed to introduce people to the gospel. And then the last thing is that death can come disguised as dedication. I think churches that are dead and dying, they really need to have that plaque out of Matthew chapter 16 where Jesus said in response to Peter's confession that upon this rock, that rock wasn't Peter, that rock was the truth about who Jesus was and what he came to do. I will build my church and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. That needs to be on the wall of every one of those churches for them to look at and ask the question of, what do we do with that? Who gets that plaque when the last person around turns off the lights and locks the door and says, we are done in business? Death can come disguised as dedication. Let me end up on this note. That in 1990, this church invited me and my family into Maryland as pastor. You can see it's a very traditional structure located in an older part, south of Baltimore. And if you look, there's no parking lot. We don't have time to go in that. It was all street parking here. And we went in there. I went in there because God had done a new work in my heart and my mind and my life. And I followed a good man, Michael Fahey, a good friend who follows us in this ministry. He had preceded me there. He'd been there 5 years, and he felt like he'd laid a good foundation for the future for them. And so we went in there and we spent 3 years, and God did an awesome work. This church that, averaged 80 in attendance through all the years, the ups and downs, the Lord blessed so that we had people that ended up attending from 9 different zip codes. There was no social media back then. There was no advertising. It was simply word of mouth. And we had to add a second service, but everything was war. Everything was war. And after 3 years, the Lord impressed on me that there was not anything worth fighting for here. The building was adequate. You couldn't continue, expand ministry and do what you need to do. And so it was time to go start from scratch. To plant a church where you didn't have to apologize for doing God's will or ask permission for doing it. And so the Lord led us into planting where we stayed for the next 24 years. Interesting note about this church is that they took a great deal of pride in everything they'd had and everything they had done. And some things that they were proud about, they talked about during lean years way back when money was tight. They went up and down the street and begged the neighbors for money to support the church. And they were proud of the fact they had done that. Listen, that should have been to their shame and their embarrassment, but it was not. So we moved on, and they got somebody else that came in, and he stayed a couple of years, and then he left, and they got somebody else who came in, and he stays a couple of years and left. And it wasn't too many years down the road that they closed the doors and they gave the property away. Now, thankfully, they gave it to a friend of ours who has a ministry, a Lighthouse Fellowship, and he's, what do they call it, repurposing the property in that area. The good, the bad, and the ugly is that church had an opportunity for a bright future. We even offered them a chance. Why don't you be the mother church of the church plant, and we can make this a win-win for everybody. And you know what they said? No. You're leaving? Go. Take your stuff and go. We went and experienced the blessing of God in what followed. The final word, verse 17, he who has ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, to him I will give some of the hidden manna, and I will give him a white stone and a new name written on the stone, which no one knows but he who receives it. I hope there's a word in this for you and to the churches that you know of who may be struggling. I confess it's been a challenge to get back into the rhythm of doing this, and I thank you for the opportunity. Let me pray for us. Father, thank you for this time. Thank you for the enabling of your Spirit, the clarity of your word, the need that we have in our day, and that you want churches to have a moment of repentance and not a moment of death. But knowing unless a grain of wheat fall to the ground and die, it will remain alone. Some things have to die, and some people have to die. So I commit them to you and us as we continue this journey of encouragement to those who need it. It's in Jesus' name we pray, and for his sake, amen. Let me hear from you. Thank you, Gina. It was good to hear from you. It's good to hear from Michael and from others. Let me hear. Send me questions. If you have suggestions, if you need some clarification of something that we've said or talked about, and then invite others. Again, we want this to be an organic opportunity, whether it's on Facebook or through YouTube or on Vimeo. If you want access to everything there, send me an email at this email address, and I'll be glad to respond to you. And if you do that and you want to talk sometime, then we'll make contact that way. And for those like Gina who support our ministry, thank you. If you want to be among those, then you can do it. You can find the medium, or if you just send me an email, I can tell you how to do that. Or if you want to just drop a check in the mail, then you can make it payable to Church Rebirth Ministries, Inc. at this address. Thank you for the privilege. Continue to pray for us. Pray for my little brother Rocky as he walks his church through this difficult time for them. God bless you. We will see you next week.